Hi, I'm Sara Wyse, and I'm an assistant professor in the biology department. Well, classroom-based assessment for me is all about making it clear whether or not students have achieved the learning objectives that I've set for them. So this for me takes place in two contexts. One is in the classroom, and that is more summative assessment, which is focused on me gauging student progress towards the objectives. So this might look like me asking questions in class. It might look like me using a clicker system, which is something that I use a lot in the classroom, to ask a question of the students and check in with their understanding. How are they doing with a particular content area or topic? I'll ask them a question, and then by them being able to click in with their clicker, I can very easily get a distribution of the class and see how well they're tracking in terms of their understanding. If most of the students are converging on the correct answer, then I am getting insight into the fact that they're actually understanding the content. If their answers are dispersed across the board and they're widespread and they're maybe not converging on the answer I would have predicted, then I give them an opportunity to talk with someone sitting around them. Often I'll use cooperative groups in this context, and they'll have a chance to talk through their thinking, and then after a few minutes I'll give them an opportunity to click back in. And at that point I can see how the impact of the conversation influenced their thinking, and then we still might have to unpack that a little bit more as a class as I ask them to explain why they chose their answer, which really gets at my understanding of where they're at in their thinking. So it helps me to understand them and their progress on the objectives. The other aspect of assessment that I use is the more formal assessments, the things we would call a test or a quiz or a lab report, to give me an understanding of student performance on these objectives. So I will look at their performance in terms of their score. I might look at, if it's an oral presentation, their fluidity using biology terminology, things that kind of give me an opportunity to collect data about how well students are achieving their objectives. Well, I've mentioned objectives a couple of times, and the reason that I am mentioning them is because objectives are essential for designing assessments. In order to have an assessment at all, I need to know what I'm going to assess, and that is where the objective comes in. So if I don't have clearly stated and measurable objectives, then I don't have any reason to assess. So for me, I have to start with those objectives and get them clearly stated in a fashion that's measurable, in a way that I can actually determine whether or not a student is making progress to those objectives. So saying something like the student will understand how the body works, well, that's really hard to assess. And so I try to refine that thinking and say, well, what is it that I really want a student to know and be able to do? And once I can articulate that and say, well, I really want them to, name the major muscle groups, or I really want them to explain how digestion of a protein from a chicken sandwich works, then I have something that I can measure as an outcome. Well, Bloom's taxonomy is a framework that was developed in the 1950s by Benjamin Bloom and his colleagues, and they designed this as a way for test writers to communicate in a similar language about the kinds of assessment questions that they're asking on their assessments. Bloom's taxonomy is illustrated here, and what you can see in this is that it's a nested hierarchy. So there's a series of 6 levels of cognitive complexity. Starting at the bottom are tasks that are easier for the brain to do. Things like listing, naming, describing, or identifying are what Bloom would classify as a lower level cognitive skill. As you progress up the hierarchy, you increasingly become more cognitively challenging for the students. So asking a student to evaluate something or interpret something or to generate a hypothesis is a much more cognitively challenging task for the student than it is for them to list, describe, or identify something. What's unique about this hierarchy is that it's nested. So if you were to ask a student to analyze something, in order for them to be able to do that analysis, they need to have the knowledge, they need to be able to comprehend how that piece of information works, they need to be able to apply it in a situation. All of those things need to be done in order to do the analysis. Likewise, if you were to ask them to evaluate something, they'd have to do the synthesizing of the content material, they'd have to analyze the content material, they'd have to apply it, comprehend it, and know it. So it becomes fairly easy to assess lower level cognitive skills embedded within a higher level cognitive process. So I will use Bloom's to give me an idea of when I construct my learning objective, what level of cognitive processing am I asking my students to achieve? Am I asking them to name the parts of the skeletal system? Am I asking them to describe how ions move across a membrane? Or am I asking them to analyze a graph or hypothesize what you could test given these conditions? When I can identify what cognitive level I am targeting with my assessment, then it becomes easier for me to determine what I should ask my students to do in an assessment so that I can check whether or not they've achieved those learning objectives. Another way that I use Bloom's taxonomy is actually with my students. I give my students my learning objectives at the very beginning of every class period that we have together, and I tell them that those are their study guide for the semester. But what I realize is that they need help interpreting those learning objectives so that they can learn and show their mastery of those learning objectives. So one thing that I give to them is this table, which has the Bloom's level, which you saw earlier in that hierarchy, along with a description of what I might be asking the student to do at each of those levels. So for the application, level 3, the question is, can I use this information? Then I give them a column of verbs, and these verbs are triggers for them. When they see them in a learning objective, they can map that learning objective to a Bloom's level. So in that same application example, I might give them a calculation-based question. And if they see the word calculate in their learning objective, they know that I'm going to ask them to use that information, not to recall that information. So they can use the verbs as a study tool to help them understand what kinds of questions I might be asking on my assessments that check their progress towards these learning objectives. So when I am designing a course, the first thing I need to do is establish my course learning objectives. And these are the big, broad outcomes that I want students to achieve by the time they finish the course. So I ask myself, what knowledge, what skills, and what abilities do I want students to have when they're done taking their 100-level biology course? And to do that, I go to a couple of different sources. My primary source is the instructors who are teaching the 200-level courses. They're going to get my students next, and so my question is, what do they want in their incoming students? And that really will frame kind of the outcomes of the course that comes before, which is my course. So that's one place that I go. The other place I go is to the course textbook. With biology, we have our big introductory biology text, and there's lots of information information in there, but what is the sections, or what are the sections that are designated for the course that I'm teaching? And then within those sections, what are the key essentials, the things that students have to have, that I would be not doing my job if they walked out of the class not knowing. And then from there, I also talk with colleagues who have taught the course before or who are teaching a similar course at other institutions, asking them what are the big key take-homes from their courses. And when I put all of that information together, I can usually generate three to five big course semester-long learning objectives that I will use to frame the context of my course. So after I have those set, that gives me a vision of where I'm going and where I'm aiming with my students. And then to help my students get to those aims, I need to look at what's happening every day in my classroom. And that's developing daily learning objectives. And those learning objectives are designed to help students progress towards the end of the semester. And so when I sit down and I look at those end of the semester goals, I look at how I can schedule and work each day to help students meet those objectives. And so I will often think about an end of the course objective and then work backwards to think what are the steps in between that students need to have, and how can I put those into my schedule and establish those daily learning objectives that will help students progress to the course level objectives. Backwards design should actually be called forwards design, I think, because it's what I do as a scientist every single day. If I'm going to walk into the lab, I always establish my goals or my aims first. Then I figure out what kind of data I need to collect in order to figure out whether or not the phenomenon I'm observing or testing actually is behaving in the way that I'm thinking it is. And then I figure out a method, and I go about and I execute my research. The exact same parallel is drawn in the classroom when I'm thinking about how to design a course and how to derive and write assessments. The very first thing that I go to are my learning objectives, and those I create based on the large course goals, and then individualized class meetings have goals that lead me to the end aim of the course, to those large course objectives. When I start developing my objectives, Bloom's taxonomy comes in very helpful to me in developing that process. And I'm going to establish those learning objectives and link them to a Bloom's level. I actually term it blooming my objectives, because I'm going to go through each one and assign it. Is this a level 2? Is this a level 3? Is this a level 1? Is this a level 6? And once I know that, then I can target the next step in the backwards design process, which is designing the assessments. So I clearly state what my learning objectives are for my students. I assign them a Bloom's level, and then I need to think about what kinds of data I could collect from my students that would give me insight into whether or not they've achieved those objectives. So I start writing every assessment that I do with a list of the objectives right in front of me. I'm asking my students to make a model of the digestive system. Then I'm going to assess them at a similar level and on similar content in my assessment. Making a model falls under level 5 of Bloom's, which is a synthesis question. It makes them pull together all of these pieces and integrate it into a whole. And so what I would then do on the assessment is think about a level 5 assessment question that I could ask them about the digestive system. Maybe it's contextualized. Maybe it's actually asking them to digest a piece of pizza and model how that pizza moves through their digestive system. But in doing that, I am making sure that the types of data I'm gathering from my assessment are going to give me insight into the objectives that I have asked my students to achieve. So I'm looking for alignment there. I will try to match on the content and also on the Bloom's level of the assessment and the objective that I am trying to determine student understanding from. And then the third piece of backwards design is classroom instruction. So I've established my course objectives. I've figured out how I'm going to assess them. You know, not just that I'm going to give them exam number 1, exam number 2, and exam number 3, but I actually know what's in all of those assessments before I even start thinking about the rest of my course. And once I know what I'm assessing, I know where I need to get my students. So then I take each unit of instruction and try to figure out my method, just like I would do in the lab. Once I've established my hypotheses, once I've figured out the types of data that I need or the statistical analysis that I'm going to do, then I think about what method I'm going to use. And there's a variety of different methods out there for getting your students towards those learning objectives, and that's where we have the ability to be flexible and creative in how we do that. But once we have those objectives set up and we know how we're going to assess our students, then that really drives the actual classroom pedagogy that we implement to try and push our students towards achieving those learning objectives. How about one on pain? Pain intensity. Why do we feel pain? Okay, I'm going to give you just a moment to talk about this one in your groups. Why is it that we feel pain? Or no, I
I think when you act
converged on option C. So the Nanooks, how come? Why did you guys pick C? I'm guessing you did.
Pick C because in the definition they gave, it's a combination of both A and B, and that was what most closely resembled their definition.
Okay. So the group that presented on pain on Wednesday indicated that we feel pain when a greater number of receptors are activated and there's a higher frequency of the action potential being passed down the nerve. So that's good reasoning and thinking about option C. All right, how about the I cup? How is the I cup different from the compound and the single I? Okay, I'm also going to give you a minute to talk through this one.
I picked D, but it's a guess.
Okay, so we had more individuals converging on B at this time. Let's actually hear from the I-cup group. Why is it that B is not true?
Well, with I, it's true that the I-cups can.
B is true. I-cups are unique in that they detect light versus dark. They can give the organism the ability to move to the light or away from that light. But other eyes can tell us where light is as well. We as humans have the ability to detect where light is coming from in our environment as well. So it's not unique in that respect. All right, another question about the eye. You found an eye from an unknown organism, and you discovered that it has mostly rods. This organism most likely lives in... Contrast stimulus response that plants and animals use by the time that we're done today. So plants face unique environmental situations because they have roots. Animals are fortunate. If they sense something in their environment that they don't like, they're going to be able to move. They can get up and leave and walk away from that stimulus in many cases, or run away from that stimulus if they need to. But since plants are rooted into the ground, their sensory response systems are actually quite fantastic because they can't move in the face of danger in their environment. So I would like you to start off brainstorming a list of plant stimulus. So what are different things in the plant's environment that they need to be aware of and possibly respond to?
We say like hot and cold weather.
Yeah, temperature. Magical uniforms.
So you said based on their like seasonal changes.
Okay, seasonal changes can include temperature changes. What else can they include? Day length. Others? Any seasonal changes? Yeah, weather, specifically.
Rain and wind. Pressure changes.
So seasons can accompany, come with a lot of different changes. Any other groups? Joey?
We put predators.
Certainly. Got to be able to detect that predator and do something to counter it. Otherwise, you're going to be eaten pretty quickly.
We also put pollinators.
Okay. Certainly. Respond to, and these can be categorized in this figure. This is actually from your text. I think you guys got a handful of these. What we didn't spend a lot of time brainstorming about was the internal responses. So just like animals, plants have the ability to detect internal changes, changes that have to do with hormones, which we're going to talk about today, and also electrical impulses. Plants can sense action potentials, and so changes in the movement of those ions can be perceived as a stimulus inside the plant. And then there's the handful of external stimuli that you guys generated the list. You've got the gases, you mentioned pressure, humidity was probably wrapped up in that, seasonal changes, along with temperature. We have touch or wind, we had water and the pH that responds to that, as well as minerals. We had barriers in their environment, so that can include rocks and things in the soil. Roots want to know where they can spread. They don't want to run into a rock and be damaged as a result of that. So being able to sense the rocks and barriers in the soil is helpful. You got herbivores or predators, and you also mentioned some pathogens and chemicals, agricultural pesticides as well, that could be part of what the plant is responding to. So the plant sensory response is very similar, in fact, to the animal sensory response. Okay, so most of you were saying option D, but we had a handful of students in other different options. Let me hear from someone in the polar bears. What did you guys choose? Okay. Okay, so you said D, but you're not sure 100% why that is. Anyone from, Joy, go ahead.
I put D, because when I think about an action potential, it's like sending all the signals back to the brain. And I feel like this is what's happening in step 2. It's transducing the signal and it's communicating to the rest of the cells. I feel like it's going back to the nucleus. So that's why I picked D.
Okay. So the rationale there for the action potential was the action potential takes the external stimulus and moves it all the way into the central nervous system. And in our case here, step 2 is to transduce the signal from the outside of the environment to the inside of the nucleus. And so as a result of that, we are transferring the signal. We're not necessarily using an action potential to do that, but it's the same analogy here in the plant model, that we're taking a stimulus from the outside and we're bringing it to the portion of the organism that's going to initiate some sort of response. Okay, so take 1 minute and, or 4 minutes, I guess, 1 minute apiece to summarize each of these steps so far in the plant response. What's that?
So, the external or internal stimulus activates the receptors, and then it transduces the signal, which then communicates the signal to the rest of the cell, and then it can either directly or activate. Oh, sorry. You're supposed to do
Okay, so we're going to compare and contrast our plant and animal stimulus responses now. There are things that are unique to the plant, there are things that are unique to the animal, and then there are things that go in the center, that both plants and animals do. So I'd ask you to work through this Venn diagram in your groups, and then we'll report out what are the similarities, what are the differences between plant and animals and their response to stimulus in their environment. We will start out with the coffee lovers. You can choose if you want to give it a similarity or a difference on either side. Just start us off. Okay. Yeah, plants have blue and red light receptors, where in the animal model we have photoreceptors, but those are not specific in this case. Our cones do detect color, and we do have cones for red and blue and green perception, but we also can integrate all of those into one response. Well, one of the first strategies that you saw in the classroom was a review sequence of clicker questions. I use those for a variety of reasons. One is I'm checking in with student knowledge on the concepts. Basic low-level blooms, knowledge and comprehension, level 1 and level 2, I can really easily assess through a series of clicker questions. They are derived from the class meeting that we had beforehand, and it's my way to check in and say, okay, are they following with the content? Where are they in their understanding? And are there any kind of areas that are cloudy or gray that we need to go back and revisit? And you saw that during the example, that sometimes the students converged right away on the right answer. And in those cases, that gave me a clear indication that they knew what was going on, they were comfortable with the material, and they were ready to move in a different direction. And then there were other cases where the class was split, maybe between 2 answers or maybe between 2 or 3 answers. And in those instances, I knew that we needed to spend a little bit more time revisiting those concepts. So what I asked the students to do at that point was to talk with their group members. And then when they do that, they had an opportunity to hear someone else's explanation, they had an opportunity to ask questions, and they had a chance to look back at their notes. And all of those things then were able to help them come to a more concrete answer. And as they did that, I was moving around the classroom and listening into their conversations. And also, when I walk by them, they're more likely to ask me a question. And so the student groups would stop me and say, hey, this doesn't make sense. And that gave me a great opportunity to work with students, even in a large class setting on a one-on-one basis. After they had some time to talk, I would ask them to re-click in their responses And in doing that, then you could really see a shift in student responses, mostly to converging on the right answer. Sometimes it happens where they converge on the wrong answer, and we can unpack that as well. But I like then, once the majority of the class has converged on the right answer, I just call out on a group, and you saw me do that, and ask for a person to respond from group A that is going to tell me the reason why they chose that answer. So not that they just saw the highest bar was option choice D when they looked at the clicker graph, but they could really explain their understanding of why that was the right answer. So that was kind of the first review that I do at the beginning of class. Just helpful for me to make sure that they're processing and helping to get the students engaged. The feedback is they really like taking those few minutes at the beginning of class to review the prior course material. After that, I give them the learning objectives so that they have a roadmap of where we're going, and they know what kinds of things they'll be doing during class based on the Bloom's level of those learning objectives. And I had 4 that I gave them that spanned all the way from Bloom's level 1 to Bloom's level 5 that we would be going through during the course of that class. Then I like to assess their incoming knowledge. And what I asked them to do was brainstorm a list of stimulus in a plant's environment that the plant might need to respond to. I have an understanding of where they're coming from just based on prior content that we've gone through during class and the responses that students have given throughout that class discussion. But what I don't know very well is what they're coming into the classroom with. What other knowledge and plants do they have? What is their background in that? And so I just ask them in their groups to put their heads together and generate a list for me of stimulus that they've heard of that plants respond to. And then they all know that the protocol in our classroom is that each group is going to be called on, and that a particular person is going to need to respond from that group. And that's one way that I encourage accountability within these discussion times. I don't just allow them to talk and then don't follow up on that. That way they know that yeah, I am going to call on them, and it might be their time to talk, and they need to be ready and accountable for the material that they have just discussed. So then we make a list on the board, and you saw that using the strategy in the classroom, and that tells me right away, okay, yep, these guys have a really great understanding of different types of environmental stimulus that the plants are going to need to respond to, and that then we can progress from there. The next thing that you saw was a short lecture clip in the video. I did about a 10-minute lecture portion on the main bulk of the content from the day, and then following and interspersed within that lecture were a few checks for understanding with the clickers again. And those were, again, just assessing basic level 1 and level 2 blooms, but getting information for me rapidly on the spot. Are the students tracking with this material? Is the pace okay? Are they answering in a way that their body language and other head nods and questions in class is indicating to me that they're actually on track with this information? And then after those clicker questions, the thing that I have tried this semester with this particular group of students that you saw is a 4-minute summary. So at the end of each little mini lecture segment, or even at the end of the whole class, I'll have a slide that is a 4-minute summary. And what that does is articulate for each person in the group what they need to summarize to the rest of their group. So person number 1 might need to summarize what some of the environmental stimuli were and how that basic response pattern would work. Others in the group would have a different task, and each person would take about a minute to summarize that within their small groups. And then as they do that, again, I'm walking around and I'm asking and listening into their conversations to see if they have any questions and kind of where they might need help in that context. And then depending on the class, depending on how things have gone so far, I may ask each group to actually summarize their part to the whole class. So I might call out on group number 2 and ask them to say, okay, well, person number 2, would you summarize that to the class? Just as another way of reviewing. And if I do that, often another group, person number 2, will jump in and say, oh, but you forgot about this, or this is also important. And that is a really solid group review, and also helps me to see what they're taking away from lecture. What do they think is important after we've had this little snippet of content, not necessarily what I think is important, but hearing it from them and what they're taking away from it is really insightful for me. Then I asked them to compare and contrast the knowledge that they had now about plants to the knowledge that we had done earlier about animals. We were working on the nervous response systems in animals and comparing that to the sensory responses in plants. So I asked them to make a Venn diagram to compare and contrast those two models that we had been working with. And I asked them to write that down as they're working in groups. And I did that for a couple of reasons. It helps them to have something concrete in their notes to go back to. And I also like to have a visual on their paper when I walk by their groups, because I can very easily then see what they're thinking and where they're going with the knowledge that they're putting together. So that was another strategy that you saw in the video. And what you didn't get to see in the video was what I did in the following class, which was addressing the final learning objective, which was to make a model of plant response to the stimulus. So we came back and had a few review clicker questions, finished up a couple of things related to plant stimulus responses, and then the kind of culmination of that unit of instruction was a more formal assessment in the context of making this model that shows how a plant responds to something like gravity or to sunlight. And the students worked together in their groups to do that, to construct this model. And when they were done with that, they turned those into me so that I could take a detailed look at their understanding in a more synthesis way. And then we share those models either using like a visualizer or an Elmo, where you can actually put student work up onto the screen, or I'll also have them, if it's a smaller model, just draw it up on the board and ask them to verbally explain what's going on in their model as well. And so that's an assessment strategy that wasn't featured in the video, but went along with the sequence that you actually saw. So traditional assessments are things that most of us do all the time. They're quizzes, they're exams, they're homework assignments, or in some cases, I might even call a lab report a traditional assessment in science, because that's something that we do very regularly. Traditional assessments are really designed to give you an end of an instructional unit kind of progress on student objectives. So how did they do after working to achieve all of these daily learning objectives for the past 3 weeks? How are they doing overall? It's more of a summative type of assessment at this point, looking at how they did over a span of time. And what is on that assessment really depends on your learning objectives. Most of the time, traditional quizzes that are multiple choice and true-false or matching tend to assess lower level Bloom's cognitive processes. Levels 1 and 2 are very, very easy to assess in those kind of traditional formats. You can assess level 3, you can assess level 4, 5, and 6 in a more traditional assessment as well. But it takes more involvement and more thought on the behalf of the instructor to actually construct a question that, especially in a multiple choice format, that's really going to get students to analyze or synthesize something. So I use traditional assessments in a couple of different ways. I do use quizzes, I do use exams within the context of the course. I also use homework assignments as well, and all of those are designed to meet certain objectives, to give students an opportunity to demonstrate whether or not they can achieve the objective. And so the design of them follows that backwards design principle. You know, what is the learning objective, and then what kind of a question can I ask to get data that shows me whether or not students have met that objective. And that can be done through the quiz, through the exam, through the homework assignment, through a lab report or a project of some sort. The other type of assessment that can be used is a performance-based assessment. And again, what you assess with a performance assessment really depends on your stated learning objectives. A performance assessment can be used to assess a low-level Bloom's question. You can sit down and have an oral exam with a student, which is performance-based. It's them not necessarily writing a response, but actually communicating in a way to you. But you could still be checking for basic knowledge and basic comprehension within that context. You could also assess all the way up to a level 5 or a level 6, and typically a performance assessment does better with these higher level cognitive processing skills, because it gives students an ability to really analyze or really evaluate something and construct a response and put the pieces together. So things that might fall into this category would be constructing a model, doing a large review project, looking at, say, an argument in a scientific paper and kind of pulling that argument apart and seeing if it's valid. That would be an evaluation kind of a question, or evaluating a claim. You could also look at a lab report or a lab practical as a demonstration of skills. That would be performance-based in science to actually try and get at student performance in that particular context. So the creation of a performance assessment, again, goes back to the learning objective. If my learning objective for my student is to analyze some data, then their performance assessment is actually going to be the student given a data set and ask them to maybe run statistical tests on those data, and then make a conclusion, kind of interpret that data set and use that information to construct a response. That response could be shared in a variety of different ways. It could be a written response. I've also used what's called a data blitz as a way for students to demonstrate their understanding of an analysis level question, where they have a data set. Sometimes it's a data set that they've actually collected on their own and had to make sense of, but then they prepare one slide with just their data, and they put it up, and they have about a 2-minute time slot where they walk through what they did to their data to get the results, and then they share what their results mean. And that's a real fast way to go through the class and check in with student processing of a higher level content or cognitive processing level. So that's one example of something that I've used in the context of the class. I also use models a lot. That's something that I found, especially in ecology, really helps students to put things together. It forces them to come up with what are the relevant components in this system and how do those components fit together. And the language that a student uses to connect one structure to another structure within the context of a model gives me insight into their processing. If they use the word photosynthesis and they can explain what that means when linking the sun to the plant, that is giving me an indication that they're processing and starting to use some of the vocabulary of the field. If they're using the sun and plants and connecting it by absorbed, well, then I get a whole nother level of insight into what students are processing. And so asking them to create something that is completely independent and asking them to pull a lot of the content together and create something new gives me a lot of insight into their thinking, and oftentimes a lot more than them just choosing a correct answer from a multiple choice kind of context. So that's one of the reasons I might use a performance assessment. Well, one of the things that makes using some non-traditional assessment challenging is that the grading of them. When you have a multiple choice exam or a multiple choice quiz, A is A and B is B, and it's pretty easy to grade in terms of time and in terms of clarity for the student. But it becomes more challenging when you're using an assessment that does not give a clear-cut this is A, this is B, this is C. And that can be frustrating for you, and it can also be frustrating for the student. And one way that I go about kind of grading the assessments that I use that are more non-traditional is by using rubrics. And rubrics are a way to quantify the vast array of responses that you're going to get from your students when you give them an open-ended option, or you give them a question that allows them to really explain what they know or model what they know. And rubrics are all about the product that the student creates. They're not about the student themselves, and that's one thing that often gets tangled in the making of a rubric. It says the student will, and that can be very hurtful for the student if they get that back and say, oh, the student is not proficient, or the student is weak, or the student is emerging. That can be challenging for them. So if you keep the focus on the product, say the lab report, did this, or the presentation showed, that makes it a little bit easier for the student to process that information. And so when you're writing a rubric, I'm always mindful of the fact that I'm focusing on the product and not on the student. The other thing that I look at when I'm writing a rubric for the first time is taking all the student work in front of me, and the first cut that I make is those that are in kind of the upper end and those that are in the lower end, and that's usually a pretty easy division to make. Then it becomes harder to tease apart, kind of what makes this pile of students over here exemplary, and what the ones in the middle, how they are different from the ones that are just below the middle, and the ones in the other end are pretty easy to sort out too. The polar ends are pretty easy, but those middle two categories, if you're going with 4 categories in your rubric, are a lot harder to tease apart, and that's where taking a look at student work before you actually, give that assignment to another group of students can be really helpful in actually defining the categories for your rubric. Ways to use rubrics in the classroom, but the first and most important way is actually to get it in the hands of the students, especially if you're assigning some sort of a project or anything that's actually going to be graded using a rubric. The students should have right when you give them the assignment, and so I actually staple mine right accompanied to the project description, so they have it when they get the project. They know how they're going to be evaluated. A couple of things that I like to do with that is initially, especially if this is the second time they're getting a rubric, say they've already done one lab report, now they're getting a second rubric for a second lab report, I actually like them to sit down and look through that rubric and say what's similar compared to the first project that we did and what's different compared to the second project that we're doing now, and highlighting a few of those things. As we move along in the semester, the rubrics get more detailed, they get more specific because the expectation of the student is getting higher. And so sometimes there's word limits being placed in there, sometimes there's information on the number of graphs that need to go into their final paper, and so I want them to be aware of some of those changes. After the student, or while the student is working on the project, I encourage them to use that rubric step by step. When they're writing the methods, have that rubric right next to them so that they know what category they want to be in. Have them target, do they want to be proficient, do they want to be excellent, and then try to write using that rubric as they go. And then when they're finally done, I ask them in their groups to use the rubric to evaluate theirs, to circle right on the rubric where do they think they fell in these categories after their final product is done. And I encourage them to do that 3 or 4 days before the paper is due. Now that doesn't always happen, but those that do then look at it and say, ooh, we fell here, and now we have a chance to make some improvements before we actually turn in our final copy in class. The other thing I've done is have students bring a draft of their paper into the classroom and swap it with another group, and let another group use the rubric on their paper as a way to get some peer feedback and also to get practice using the rubric. Students do need practice using these things. They may have seen them before, they may or may not have used them or known how to use them, so part of my responsibility, I feel, is to help them learn how to use these tools that we're giving to them to help them be successful. And when they do know how to use those tools, the quality of work that the student actually produces at the end is much greater because you're seeing a student who says, okay, these are the expectations, and I'm going to make sure that I meet these expectations, and I did. I can see that in my work. And that self-evaluation, that self-reflection of here's the standard, here's how I'm doing compared to that standard is invaluable, I think, in terms of student progress, and also a lifelong skill, giving students an ability to say, okay, here's where I want to be and here's where I am. How can I take steps to get there? Or here's where I am and here's the standard. Oh, we're pretty close and I feel pretty good about that. And so I actually like to use that a lot in the context of rubrics in the classroom. Sometimes they may be accompanied with a checklist, just so students make sure that they turn in everything that they need. That's not always the case, because sometimes the rubric is detailed enough that we actually don't need a separate checklist to accompany it. But that might be one other thing. If there are lots of loose ends, students need an abstract, students need a draft, students need a list of references, students need to staple the articles that they, read for their paper to the back, whatever it might be. Having a checklist just helps to make sure that there's nothing left behind on the student's end when they turn something in. There's no, oops, I forgot that, if they can actually walk down that list and check it off. So that helps me in grading too, because then there's less missing pieces to a project and I have everything there at once to grade. I use groups a lot in my classes, and one of the reasons that I use them is that actually models the practice of science. Science is not done as one individual in a lab by his or herself, and so I like to get my students used to collaborating with one another. But that requires a lot of work up front to kind of encourage both group accountability and individual accountability, and those are things that we start off with right at the beginning of the semester when students form groups. One of the things I ask them to do first right away is to make a group contract about how they're going to function together and what their group role is, and then to follow up with that individual piece. Each individual person needs to say how they are going to contribute and kind of what their role is. So we start off very simple, low stress kind of a task, but it gives them the idea that they're going to be accountable as a group and as an individual. And then as we go through the course, I kind of scaffold their use of the groups and their accountability. At the beginning of the semester, I want them to get comfortable talking with each other. And so a lot of times I'll ask them to talk to their group, and then when I call out on a group during our class session, I don't really care who responds from that group. I just want to hear from someone, and I'll just say, please, someone in the group, tell me what your group was thinking. So then I'll hear from one person. And over about a course of 3 weeks, we'll rotate through the groups many times, hearing from them. And typically what I notice at that point is 1 or 2 people are comfortable responding for the group. So I know that 1 or 2 people are vocal and able to share their understanding, but now I'm at the point where I'm ready to push the groups a little bit further. And at that point, each person in the group assumes a number or a color or a letter. And what I have done, I've taken 2 different approaches. One is I'll put a letter, if I have person A, B, C, and D within a group, I'll put that letter up on the board when I get into the classroom. And they know that day, whichever group I call on, person B is going to be the one who has to talk today. And then this semester I'm trying something a little bit different. I have assigned all the groups A, B, C, and D, and then I'll ask them to float through that order on their own. So the first time I call on one of the groups, person A is going to respond. And the next time I call on that same group, person B is going to respond. That actually is working better in a small class because of the quickness with which I rotate through calling on the groups that I have in my classroom. And so that then forces that person to be ready to respond to a particular question. And they know that they're going to be accountable for it. I've had some instances when I taught larger classes where I'd actually put the group that's going to be responsible for reporting on my slide. If I gave them a question that they were going to discuss, I would say, this group, the name of that group, the Fantastic Four or something, then they're going to be responsible for sharing that piece of information. I've moved away from that a little bit because it kind of puts the other groups off the hook, and their intensity of their conversations tends to decrease a little bit because they know they're not going to be called on. But if you keep that surprise element of everyone is accountable and it could be your group, then you keep them engaged in that conversation. So those are the more informal ways that I assess the groups and have both group accountability and individual accountability. In terms of a more formal way that I do this, anytime they're involved in a large project together that has high stakes, there's a group component to that grade and an individual component, a participation component. The group component of the grade is, whatever they submit together as a final product, that grade is going to be dispersed among the people within the group. I can see from their work in lab and their work in class who's really pulling the group and who's maybe lagging behind within that group. So I have an idea of what's going on in those groups, but I actually like to get feedback from the students about that as well. So I give them what's called a group effort analysis form. And the students each get one of these. It's a homework assignment, so it's not done sitting right next to their group members. And I ask them to rate themselves and their group members in both a qualitative way, what kind of work did they do, and a quantitative way, how much of the work did they do, or what percentage of effort did they put in. Then I take all of those sheets, and pretty quickly a pattern can emerge if you look at all 4 people in the group and their responses all together. And a lot of times that matches up with what I've been seeing in class, and in some cases it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then I'll often sit down with the group and kind of talk through, what's going on in terms of group dynamics and how did they work together on this project if there's a large discrepancy in their responses. And then those points are what I will assign. I don't have the students grade each other. They're just giving me feedback on how they're working together. And then that goes into the individual component of the grade. The other thing I do with, say, a large lab report that students are writing is each person in the group needs to be accountable for everything in that paper. So if their name is on the front, I should be able to walk up to them and ask them to explain how they did the statistics or why they used this source in the discussion. And I found that when I do that, when I actually follow up with that, when I walk up to a student and say, hey, can you explain to me how you got these data? Then they know they have to be accountable for it. Then even if they do the divide and conquer approach, someone does the intro, someone does the methods, they understand that they're going to be accountable for that. And so I may do that on an assessment. I may put a question on the assessment that says, explain how you did your data analysis in your paper. And then each person has to do that completely on his or her own. And that's one way that I really keep up the individual accountability. And they know it's not just a blanket statement. You might be accountable for this. When I actually follow up on that early in the semester, I set the stage for following up on that throughout the semester, and then they know that they're going to be accountable for the material as well, not just as a member of the group, but as an individual. Well, validity is one of those terms that you hear thrown around a lot with assessment, but validity is really all about if I know that my objective says X, does my assessment actually assess that objective? And there's a lot of different ways that you can do that to make sure that your objectives are aligned with your assessment. Webb's alignment criteria is one of those that's widely used in large-scale assessment. But for me, on a practical basis, when I'm in my classroom, I do a real quick check for content validity. So what I do with that is look at my objective, and I first identify the content that it's on. So what is it that I'm assessing my students on? Is it photosynthesis? Is it respiration? What is that broad concept that I'm looking at? Then from there, I determine the Bloom's level. So what level of cognitive process am I asking my students to achieve to in that particular learning objective? When I go to write my assessment then, I'm trying to make sure that I have the same content reflected at the same Bloom's level. So I'm trying to be consistent in that respect where I'm actually measuring, I'm actually trying to get data on what I said that I would get data on. I don't think it's fair to the student to put a learning objective that says identify something and then assess them at a level 6 on their assessment. That would be kind of a bait and switch, and I don't feel comfortable doing that with my students. So that's one of the ways that I ensure we have some validity within the exam that I'm writing or the quiz that I'm writing or even the homework assignment that I am doing. If I have a higher level Bloom's question on that assessment, say a level 5 or a level 6 that's clearly stated in their learning objectives, then I match that with the content that objective is at as well. So there's a match on the content and a match on the Bloom's level when I'm dealing with validity. If I were doing a little bit more intense statistical analysis with my data, I might also look at item difficulties and make sure I have a spread of item difficulties within my assessment. But practically, when I'm writing those assessments on the busyness of the semester, those are my two quick checks to make sure that I'm assessing what I said I would assess. Well, reliability has to deal with consistency, and it's this idea that are my results actually reliable from an assessment? So one of the real quick kind of basic ways I explain that is, are the students who are doing well in my class every day, that are demonstrating good scores on clicker responses, stating that they understand the content when I'm asking them to explain it, are they the ones that are also doing well on the assessment? Is there consistency in their performance? If they're not, then my instrument that I'm using to assess them is probably faulty in some way, because it's not actually reliable. It's not giving me a consistent result, and that means I need to look at those data. So what I do to do reliability during the course of the semester is, first I will write up the assessment, and then I actually give it to one of my TAs to take. I say, here, I need you to take this. They've been through my course. They did well in my course because they're a TA for me. And so if they can take that assessment and they do well on the questions that I would expect them to do well on, and that gives me a first line pass of reliability. If they don't, or if I get an answer that, whoa, I wasn't expecting this response, it gives me a chance to go back and revise that before I give it to my students. There's no other way to pilot test items like you would on a large assessment during the course of the semester, so that's how I kind of take a first pass at that. And then when I get my data after the students take their exam, I actually put it into an Excel spreadsheet by student, and then each question I put down the number of points that they earn. And then I run simple descriptive statistics on each item. I look at the mean, I look at the standard deviation, I look at the standard error, and I'm trying to look at the items, and then I flag the ones that have extremely high variation, or the ones where, okay, my top students did not do well on this item, and that causes me to look at the reliability of that item, and it helps me to refine my assessment over time to make them become more reliable.
The thing I've done too that has helped me maybe more than any single thing, if I'm using a multiple choice test, for example, I allow students to put written arguments in on items that they missed. And in fact, I encourage them to do that, and then I tell them I do go through all of them. I look to see if you have written arguments, if they can make a good case for it, and I'd say a third of the time they do.
Yeah.
I mean, I give them credit for it.
Yep.
If they don't, I tell them why, that kind of thing. But it really helps me flag those items that that I'm getting a lot of questions about, a lot of comments on. And that, for me, has been the single best way to really get rid of my, I call them clunkers, to get rid of the really poor items.
Yeah.
But it also turns it into an educational experience for the student, because they're having to go back. I encourage them to use your book, use your notes, whatever you want to make your argument, would be great. So it really takes their thinking a step deeper, but they also really appreciate kind of the fairness in the deal. Yeah. And they really, really appreciate that. But I would say I do it all the time, but the first time I give a test, I get a lot of comments on things, and then I go back and just revise most of them. So usually by the third time, the test is pretty solid, in a sense too. Yeah. But it has a lot of benefits, not just helping me make a better test, but it really helps them in a lot of ways too. So
Yeah, I've done that more so because they're unfamiliar with taking a multiple choice assessment right away. I will, the first go around, we spend time actually revisiting the assessment as a whole, and they have an opportunity to say where their answer might have been incomplete or incorrect, and why, and then an opportunity to correct it or enhance the question. I've done both of those, and that seems to help them. And of course, they want to do that on all of their assessments, but it's a way to at least get them comfortable and familiar with a non-multiple choice type of assessment at the beginning of the semester. Well, the best thing that I can share about assessment is have really clear, measurable learning objectives. To start there, to have those clearly defined so that when you say, okay, it's test time, I need to write an assessment, you have a place to go. You have a blueprint for your assessment right there in front of you. And by having them be measurable, not something like the student will understand, but something that's very, very concrete and measurable. The student will be able to calculate rate, and the student will be able to graph complex data using a logarithmic scale or something along those lines. Those are measurable, and those are something that give you a way to actually write your assessment. So start there. Really clearly establish those learning objectives. And then from there, look at the Bloom's level. Really simple and easy to do. Just I call it blooming. Just bloom those assessment or those objectives. Assign each of them that Bloom level, and then you have an idea not only of the content, but you have an idea of what kind of question you're going to ask them. If it's a Bloom's level 1, multiple choice might work excellently to assess that, and you could write a very great knowledge level question, making sure that you're testing that learning objective with that question. If it's a level 4 application or some sort of an analysis level, then you're going to need to think outside of the box potentially. You could give students a data set and ask them to explain it, or something else along those lines. Maybe give them a novel case. If we've been working with a particular organism in a particular habitat in class, I might switch up the organism and switch up the habitat and ask them to apply what they've learned in the class to a novel content area and a novel habitat. And so I'll tend to think just a little bit outside of the box in terms of the questions that I could ask them. So those are kind of my big 3, establish your clear learning objectives, think about the Bloom's level of your assessment, and then think outside of the box. Assessment doesn't have to be paper pencil, assessment doesn't have to be multiple choice or fill in the blank or, matching. It can be more than that, and your students will maybe be a little taken aback by that at the initial assessment opportunity, but they're going to grow along with you in that process of really trying to figure out the best way to measure your students' understanding of those learning objectives.